Thank you for joining us today. Please remember to remain on mute. And if you have questions, please send them directly to me, Susan James, via the chat feature. And we will take some time at the end for some questions. This session is being recorded. Dr. Lisa Janetian is the Pritzker Professor of Early Learning Policy Studies here at the Sanford School of Public Policy and Center for Child and Family Policy Faculty Fellow. She's an applied economist whose research encompasses a variety of areas concerning child poverty, from income security and stability to early care and education, with a particular focus on how child poverty shapes children's development. We are so pleased to have her today, and thank you, Dr. Janetian.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today. I thought I'd start by setting the stage of what child poverty, predominantly in the US, looked like prior to this pandemic, COVID-19. And I like to start with stories. Stories give us powerful narratives and some salience for understanding children's poverty. So let's start here with 4-year-old Pablo. Nearly 4.7 million of the children living in poverty prior to this pandemic is like 4-year-old Pablo. Born in the US, Pablo is the son of Lucia and Mateo, an unmarried couple from Ecuador. Like 1/4 of Hispanic children in the US, Pablo's parents are undocumented. Like the majority of Hispanic children, Pablo's parents are employed, relying on earnings as their primary source of income, though not necessarily in the formal labor market. And what you see in this chart, and that I've drawn from a study called the US Financial Diaries, is Pablo's family finances over the course of 1 year. And there are a couple of themes to take away from this. One is that it comes from multiple sources, it's highly variable, and Pablo is fortunate. His family has a little bit of money set aside for emergencies, though not in the formal banking sector. And here's a second wonderful child to think about, 4-year-old Riley, who is not unlike the 3.3 million of the children living in poverty who are African American. Riley is the son of Lauren, a single mother living in eastern Mississippi. Riley's mother has a full-time job as an administrative assistant, and though stable, is not enough to pay for expenses. She borrows interest-free from her mother, which you can see here in the chart. And one benefit that she very much relies on that helps with meeting their needs is called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which comes as a lump sum payment at tax refund time. These give you the context of 16% of children in the US who are residing in poverty prior to this pandemic. And so I'd like to start our thinking about poverty amidst a pandemic exactly with that word, context. And one of the things that I've thought about and I've worked on with my co-authors, Eldar Shafir, is that poverty is beyond a financial circumstance. In fact, poverty drains resources across multiple dimensions: money, time, and mental bandwidth. Uncertainty further drains those resources. If we think every day we wake up with a certain amount of attention, a certain amount of mind available to us to make decisions, in the context of poverty, that is drained even more. What this means in a highly uncertain landscape that is global and unpredictable, like a pandemic, is that all three components of poverty are experiencing even more pressure. Furthermore, as we've seen with the shutdown and the stay-at-home orders that are happening around the country, we are asking more of economic providers who have dual roles as caregivers, which they had prior to the pandemic, who are now have to take on a teaching role for their children. The second point here is related to work. And I set the stage with Pablo and Riley. The majority of income-poor children are in families where at least one person is working. This varies a little bit by different types of families, but earnings remain a sole source of economic stability for many, especially Hispanic families. And I want to point out that work not only provides financial resources, but also provides purpose, and it provides human agency for caregivers. The pandemic has had a shocking effect on work. Nearly 40% of households with income less than $40,000 lost jobs as of April. Not all work is formal, with predictable W-2 forms eligible to receive unemployment insurance or emergency cash. And indeed, these are the two mechanisms that we've talked about so far from a federal and a government response to the pandemic. Not all work is safe. The burden of most essential work, that should be in quotes, as we're learning, is carried by Black and Hispanic, mostly low-wage workers, and furthermore, who are in positions that do not have bargaining power. The third component is thinking about the US safety net. And indeed, one thing that we've learned through this recent pandemic is our current US safety net, while has satisfied many goals and has largely been built since the 1960s, is not designed well to be recession-proof. The two core programs of the US safety net currently, prior to COVID-19, are food stamps, also known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And in fact, food stamps has expanded since the Great Recession, and furthermore is dispersed through a very efficient mechanism, electronic benefit transfers on cards. So in effect, it's become mainstream. The card looks like a debit card. The other core program is the Earned Income Tax and comparable refundable credits. And this has also expanded over the past 20 to 30 years. And recent estimates show that the Earned Income Tax Credit alone lifts 4.2 million children out of poverty. So now let's turn to the pandemic. What does that mean? How does the safety net been able to respond? How can it be used to respond? In April 2020, colleagues Lauren Bauer, the Hamilton Project at Brookings Institution showed nearly 1 in 5 families with children less than age 12 reported child hunger. These were not families reporting child hunger prior to this period. We've also seen that local governments, schools, mostly through their free and subsidized food programs, and food banks are stepping up and being asked to step up in ways that they did not have the infrastructure to do well, because of the first time they're being asked to step up. And they're being asked to manage food supply side disruptions. And this response, and in fact, because they've been so effective, there's something called the pandemic EBTs. So this is the acronym for electronic benefit transfers on cards. And so these are being used through these local governments as another mechanism for giving cash to families to spend on food. Finally, job loss means that safety nets that are conditioned on work are not very effective. If you don't have a job with formal earnings, in which you can prove some earnings, you are not eligible for refundable tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. So in essence, the two largest safety net programs are not designed well to handle the response and the need right now. Where does this leave us? One of the most interesting things that has surprisingly happened in the context of the pandemic is the use of cash transfers. A $1,200 check was sent out to families through one of the many mechanisms that I just spoke about before. And in fact, I think there's a really promising question here about whether cash transfers can be used, and how do we become more forward thinking about how to get cash transfers, money quickly into the hands of people that can both protect their well-being and can also keep the economy running. I've been lucky to be a principal investigator on a large project that had been in the works for over 10 years called Baby's First Years. And in this study, we're using a randomized control design methodology, which essentially means that half of the mothers with infants in this study at the time of birth are receiving $333 in unconditional cash through a debit card monthly for the first 40 months of their child's life. And then the other half are also receiving a monthly unconditional cash gift of a smaller amount of $20. What this means overall is $12,000 of income boost for babies who are born at poverty level in the hospital. And so we were sort of in the business of trying to answer this question about poverty reduction and doing it through a cash transfer before the pandemic. And we're excited to be able to continue to learn from these findings, perhaps inform a way that the US might think about structuring a cash transfer that will reach all economically vulnerable families. I would like to just note that I think we are in a historic moment in the US. And in fact, we can switch this into an opportunity. We can think about Pablo and Riley, who represent the majority of income poor children before the pandemic. And we can ask this question: what is the safety net we need to create in the US that involves income support, considering level as well as stability, childcare, and healthcare? The pandemic has also allowed us to really think hard about turning a lens towards children. They do not vote, they do not have a direct voice. They've been slightly neglected in the conversation to date. Yet we have graduates who are going to be the future workforce, both high school and college graduates. And we have a new generation being born in this context as we speak. And we also see some promise how the intersection of federal and government, local and state response might be able to work together to spark some policy innovations at the ground up. And I think, one exciting thing that we're kind of seeing, which has been a default of what's happening from the federal government, is these interstate partnerships. So collectives of states working together, whether it is to support their healthcare side of this or to support their economically vulnerable families. And on that positive note, I do want to just share today an exciting editorial that came up from one of my colleagues at Duke Sanford and at Gaspin Pines, who also has sort of a bit of hope. It is not too late to support our families. Here you see the story of Luciana, who's working at Burger King and Dunkin' Donuts before this pandemic struck, and her sort of call to action through this experience and an opportunity to preserve income of families like Luciana's, who's a parent of a young child, through programs like the Paycheck Guarantee Act. Thank you. I am ready for questions and conversation.
Okay, Lisa, our first question
Yes.
comes from Carl Rist, and he is asking, is the notion that work provides purpose and agency really an evidence-based concept, or is this a middle-class construct? Wouldn't UBI, which could provide critical financial resources, be beneficial for vulnerable households?
That is an excellent and multi-component question. So I'm going to unpack the first part of it, which is thinking about the meaning of work and how that might vary for lowest income workers compared to middle and higher income workers. So it is correct that there's not concrete empirical evidence to support that contention, but we've learned a lot from what I'll call qualitative research. So these are conversations with families that are collected in a systematic manner. And what we learn from those conversations is work means a lot. It means a lot to everyone. The idea of being able to go out, gain earnings and income and provide for your family means a lot no matter where you are in the income distribution. Now, how difficult that is varies quite a bit. And I think that's the distinction. The meaning of work probably has similar implications. The quality of that work varies. And how difficult it is to preserve that positive meaning of work will vary depending on where you are. The universal basic income conversation is a really fascinating one. And as we all know, had been gaining momentum prior to COVID-19. I think is gaining traction now with emergency cash response being part of the solution for what's happening today to economically vulnerable families. And one of the things that we've thought about with the Baby's First Year study that I just mentioned is work feasible, and especially during the first year of a baby's life? And are the pressures of juggling hours the best way to set up children for success? And indeed, if you think about this from children's development in the first few years, demanding more of work and more of earnings, especially if you are a low-wage worker, might not be optimal. And certainly something like a universal income might be the best policy. Next question.
Okay,
I don't know if you want to do more Q&A response.
No, we have. So Jonathan Koch is asking, can you
Yes.
tell us more about paycheck protection in the context of modern monetary theory?
Okay, I am not an expert on modern monetary theory, but I can say a few things. Certainly countries, Scandinavian countries, in fact, part of their response to this pandemic has been through a much more systematic and assertive paycheck guarantee program where they've protected workers' wages up to 70 to 80%, right? And over a pretty long time period. This has benefits in two ways. People still have their money, so therefore they can go on, make sure there's food on the table. They can demand for goods and services, so they're keeping the economy going. It also means that they remain loyal and connected to a job. So it makes re-entry back into work a much smoother process on both sides for the employer and the employee. It works better in countries where the majority of people are employed in a formal system and therefore are easy to reach through employers that are filing taxes and people that are filing taxes. The system in the US is much more parse and parcel. And so while this could work for a majority of workers, it might not work for all workers and certainly will not fairly work for the lowest income workers, many of whom are people of color. And in fact, you're seeing that evolving through this conversation, right? The coverage of gig workers is something that's novel and challenging for the US relative to other contexts. The way you can dribble up to monetary policy is related to sort of consumer demand and how it can respond to supply side questions and not necessarily my expertise.
Okay, so we have another question in from
Yes.
Priscilla. She's asking, it's interesting that education was not listed and what you think is needed. She said you listed income, healthcare, food. Where does education fit into the poverty and economic mobility scale?
Yes, excellent question. That was a terrible, neglectful mistake on my part. I was very focused on, this tells you where my mind has been, on what we need to do in the immediate future. Education is a core human capital investment. This is my economic side speaking, and probably what I should have done, which would have been better, is call childcare early education and childcare. So starting early with thinking about when children are not at home under the care of their parents, what is the quality of what they're receiving in non-parental care. Childcare is needed when parents work. We're seeing that tension playing out now. How can essential workers get back to work if childcare centers and childcare providers can't provide care for their children? We have an opportunity to couple that with early education. Cash transfers, let me mention, at least with the Baby's First Years study, certainly one of the things we're interested in is how that extra cushion in the lives of these low-income mothers may be used to reinvest in themselves, whether it's completing their own education or getting a new certificate, job training, so improving their own kind of economic welfare and therefore the economic security of the family. So thank you for that catch. Education is an essential component to reducing child poverty.
And so I asked that question a little bit before Priscilla had finished writing, and
Okay.
it was a two-part. So she's saying, if work is important to agency, what are your views about the future of work, jobs today not being there tomorrow?
Good question. I tend to be a little more optimistic potentially than maybe economists more generally who've thought about this. There will be a recession. It's happening now. It will have long-term impacts. it will differentially and negatively affect our low-wage workers in our economy. I also think, however, that this pandemic is going to spark innovation and, especially in healthcare, and that might actually open up some job opportunities at all levels. That will not happen immediately, but I imagine that it will open up some new avenues for employment in the future. And I think going back to my theme before, wouldn't it be terrific if we could figure out how to design a safety net system that is complete and comprehensive and equitable, that can go hand in hand with potential new ways to think about jobs and work in the future.
Okay, our next question is from Santiago D'Ambrosi, and he's asking, what is your opinion on automatic stabilizers, and do you think they should be included in the next stimulus package?
So automatic stabilizers, a specific example. That's a very generic.
I've now unmuted you, Santiago, so that you can answer or fill out your question.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of, for example, looking at, in terms of the safety net, for example, SNAP, looking at whether you want to, instead of having Congress approve more funding, automatically give them funding depending on the data that's available.
Yeah.
Brookings has done a lot of job in terms of doing research in automatic stabilizers. So I was thinking what your opinion is.
Yeah, so that's really good. And I think, thank you for that clarification. Super helpful. Okay, so I think the idea that you have in mind with automatic stabilizers, and that's been part of the conversation certainly at Brookings, is creating a safety net that reaches all equitably, includes a safety net that can be responsive, right, during recessions. Meaning, can it ramp up quickly to protect families, and then maybe scale back when the economy is humming along and people are having stable jobs and are able to rely on earnings in a stable way. And so some of the recommendations are, can we create, for example, a food voucher system that can be quickly responsive, right? And so it can expand according to certain economic indicators, so that it doesn't require kind of bottlenecks in legislation and political approval, but just responds very quickly. I most certainly think that should be part of our conversation if we are to honor this idea of a true safety net in the US. Thank you for that question.
So Lisa, your next question comes from your colleague, Dr. William Sandy Darity, and he was asking, to what extent should major non-incremental policies be considered, such as national health insurance, federal job guarantee, postal public banking? And then he said, I might add that a federal job guarantee is an automatic stabilizer, preferable in my view to a UBI in isolation, although UBI plus job guarantee would be great.
Yeah, good question, Sandy. I wish this could be more of a conversation between you and I, but that's okay. We can do a question response for now. Certainly something like a federal job guarantee would be a mechanism for helping solve the uncertainty and the lack of gaining enough earnings in the current low-wage labor market. And so if we're thinking about only how do we solve this low end of the labor market kind of problem, UBI, universal basic income, is not necessarily going to be the solution. Giving people, we know from evidence, giving people experience in work, making sure they're finishing their education, high school degree, ideally some college, and getting into a good full-time job with benefits is the path to economic security. And a job guarantee would get us there probably faster, more efficiently. We have evidence to support that as compared to something like a universal basic income. I've already forgotten the other components, but that was the part that kind of stuck in my mind from your question. Your very good question, Sandy.
So I think that.
Yeah, actually, here's the wrinkle that I want to add. And I think it gets complicated. You know, how do you think about job guarantees when you're thinking about families, especially with young children, right? And so how do you, it's not reasonable to think about sending 3-week-olds into childcare centers. And so we do have to be flexible about some of these policies if one of our objectives is to set children on a positive path. You know, work in that first year of life is a very high demand and not always a reasonable one.
Susan unmuted me, so
Yay, all right.
so I could comment. Yeah.
Great.
So I absolutely agree with you that there are some serious considerations concerning childcare in the earliest period of life. But I think one of the objectives that those of us who've been thinking about a job guarantee have in mind is that that a component of the occupations, and an important component of the occupations, would be the provision of care work, elder care and child care, and that this kind of system would provide us with the opportunity to professionalize care work. And so then we could have people who were doing this as an occupation and as a profession who were well paid or decently paid to do this work. I mean, one of the big issues that's become apparent in the COVID-19 crisis is we have a significant amount of essential work that needs to be done in this society, but it's frequently very poorly paid. And so while there might be serious concerns about having the care work for a 1 or 2 month old being shifted to somebody other than their parents, and I think we could make adjustments in that direction. But I think as children become a bit older, having a professional child care service would be a fantastic departure from what we have now.
Yeah, I am in agreement with you, Sandy. And I think a smart policy would really recognize children's developmental milestones and what's good and healthy for them and good and healthy for their families. And certainly what you described is a really good match with that thinking.
Thank you.
So we are drawing close to the end of our time, but I wanted to give you the last word. And also it is clear that in the future, we may have to have another conversation and have you and Dr. Darity on together to have a further discussion. Yeah. So I just wanted to thank everybody for joining, and just Lisa, let you have the last few minutes to wrap us up.
I don't have anything in particular to say. I'm just delighted to have this opportunity to speak to Duke alums. And I look forward to engaging with you further. There will be a follow-up link to this lecture and some of the materials I've written about. And I hope we can keep the conversation continued with other Duke Sanford faculty on board.
I do have one more question then. Okay. We have 2 minutes. I'm going to sneak it in.
Okay.
So a colleague is asking, outside of policy, can you talk about nonprofit or community-driven safety nets, GoFundMes, food banks, and how much support they're contributing to marginalized and at-risk families at this point?
Yes. All right. So excellent question. I think right now we don't have a good way of quantifying the way in which private and even publicly funded community organizations, for example, are helping support economically vulnerable families. I think what we're learning is because they are the touch points for individuals and families, the closest, right, who understand their local populations, who understand the challenges with reaching them, they are a untapped platform for sort of baking in more formally as part of our social safety net. So just as some context, you know, we have a little bit of history that seems to point in the direction of this, but has not kind of panned out the way we had hoped, which was our original cash assistance program in our country was called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It evolved to Temporary Assistance to Needy Families in 1996. And the thing that really changed it, and why it's not even part of the conversation now, is it was work-based and it is a very low take-up kind of program now. I mean, in fact, the money can be used for a variety of things. Very little of it is used for basic cash assistance. one of the evolutions that also happened since 1996 is that state and local governments became in charge of the decisions on how to use those monies. And we're seeing, therefore, that money being devoted to early care and education, child protective services, sometimes employment programs, sometimes for a local or state earned income tax credit supplement. So I think, I think what we're seeing now in response is a recognition that local means we know you, we know how to reach you, and especially in social distancing, we know people can't travel far. So local makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But I don't think that argues for no role for federal government, right? So a combination of both of those seems like a promising avenue to pursue.
Thank you, Dr. Janetti, and we appreciate you being with us today, and thank all of you for joining us. And as we mentioned earlier, we will follow up tomorrow with a link to the recording of this talk, and also Dr. Janetti has shared a few other links to articles and studies that may be of interest. Again, thank you all for joining us, and if you are interested, you can go to the Sanford website. We have a list of further activities and events coming up, and we'll send those to you as well. So thanks to all.